Boardroom, Chapter 24, 3997 BC, Wedge. Knapp's artillery fire continued until after sunup. It was so constant that the right flank of Gabe's army began to not only become somewhat demoralized, but as the casualties mounted, he had to ease the line back, creating a convexity. Discussions among the good corps generals was getting more and more heated as the line crept back toward them, foot by foot. When the generals finally went back to ask if they could begin the assault, old Yulee just stared at his subordinate generals in silence. The generals went over to Gabe in hopes he would see the light, but Gabe was preoccupied with moving more and more troops into that left flank, preparing for the expected onslaught from Ad, and he basically ignored the frenzied generals. Just after sunup, Ad's artillery opened fire on Dwight's boys over on Gabe's left flank, and for the next hour a convexity also began to form on Dwight's line, which receded slowly to protect its men. The end result of all this bombardment was that the center was now the leading edge of Gabe's line and was becoming more and more vulnerable with each exploding laser shell. Gabe still expected the attack to come from the left, though he was also suspicious of something over Dwight's way as troop concentration was increasing on the right as well as the left. So Gabe began to send men from the center to his left flank as well as his right, finally coming to the conclusion that Bells might use a two-pronged attack from Knapp on Gabe's right, as was originally thought, plus Ad on Gabe's left. "You see what I see?" Bells said, a big grin on his face. "What's that?" Knapp said. "Look out there at what Gabe is doing." "Well, my stars, General, he's playing right into our hot little hands," Ad said, a rare smile creasing his thin lips. "What time do we go?" Ad said. 10 bells, gentlemen, and if it all goes well, we should be feasting on Pop's table by lunchtime." The optimism was more than warranted, as Bells had amassed nearly half of all his troops at the center of his line, hidden from Good Corps' view. They were dispersed by well-controlled shields, so could not be detected by the enemy. All the shifting had been done under the cover of night, and Gabe was playing right into their hands. Precisely at 10 a.m., shelling began on Gabe's exposed and extremely thin center. At the same time, Bell's center force began to advance steadily and in orderly fashion. The laser shelling continued as the center of Bell's line closed in on the weakest part of Gabe's army. Gabe, seeing the trouble he was soon going to be in, ordered a slow withdrawal of the center of his line, hoping to again line up with his two flanks. What he did not see was that the number of troops leading the assault on his center was far greater than he had anticipated. He had stacked both his flanks, and to his chagrin the artillery had pushed his two strongest points back. Now his weakest point would be there for the taking. He realized the center of his line would never be able to withstand the onslaught he now knew was coming. In addition to the methodical onslaught on his center, Bells had readjusted his artillery to fire behind the center of Gabe's line, essentially pinning them down. If they retreated, they were subject to unrelenting artillery fire, and if they did not, they would likely be cut to pieces by the huge force advancing on them. The result of this predicament was that Gabe's troops began retreating toward their own flanks, further weakening the center. Gabe and his generals watched, but still did not realize that disaster was imminent. Fortunately for Gabe's army, one soldier did see what was about to happen and began taking steps to avert the defeat that was staring Good Corps in the face. Without orders from his superiors, the observed general began to move his troops on the right flank forward. Artillery fire was now concentrating more on the center of Gabe's line, and it was easier for him to maneuver. He hoped against hope that Dwight would see what he was doing and would follow suit. The leading edge of Bell's central assault came in contact with Gabe's weakened center at 10:15 a.m. The skirmishing was the most fierce of any so far in the 3 days of battle. Despite overwhelming numbers, Gabe's central divisions put up a fierce resistance and slowed Bell's advance. This slowing accentuated the carnage, but Bell's boys continued to advance inch by bloody inch. Fortunately for Gabe, Dwight had seen Yuli's forward push on Gabe's far right and had mimicked the move from his position on Gabe's left. By now, Bell's push had reached halfway through the center of Gabe's line. But Yuli's and Dwight's advance had now put them in a position to flank Bell's huge wedge from either side. Evil Ink's artillery fire was concentrated at Gabe's center so as not to hit his own men flanking his assault. Artillery was essentially stationary, and the receding of Good Corps' flanks took them out of effective range from the earlier bombardment. Bell's now opened up his own artillery on the assault column. Bell's euphoria with the successful advance of his military wedge did not allow him to notice the forward movement of first Yuli's and then Dwight's advance. But of course Knapp and Ad did. Unfortunately, they were helpless, as over half their force was moving in to support the wedge. They put a few artillery volleys on the flanks of the column, but could not send forward any significant force to slow the advance of Good Corps' flanks. Both Knapp and Ad became very concerned, but the din of battle did not lend to good communication with their leaders. Had they gotten to Bell's, he would likely have not listened to them anyway. His wedge continued to bore forward through the bloody field. However, the advance of his wedge now began to slow further as Yuli's and Dwight's flanking forces began to chew on the sides of his column. Finally, just as Bell's massive wedge reached its goal and began to break through the center of Good Corps' line, the entire wedge, some 5 billion strong, ground to a screaming halt. At the apex, there was nothing in front of them but wide open space leading toward Pop's palace on Orion. But for some strange reason, the massive wedge remained stalled in its tracks. Once Bell's had broken through, he expected his boys could march on into Pop's palace, take the old man captive, and declare victory. The plan was to take Junior hostage and negotiate the old man into a corner. Pops would be forced to capitulate. They all knew Pops would not sacrifice his son for any reason, even his own throne. Despite the stalling of the wedge, things were pretty bleak in Gabe's center. By this time, all his generals and even he had taken up the sword and were fighting in hand-to-hand combat with their troops. Pops and Spirit were now staring out at the carnage. Pop's tear-stained face was now fire-red with anger. Spirit's tear-stained face was ghostly white. "I've got to stop this, babe," he said. "The whole lot of these crazies will be dead by sunset." "Honey, you promised," Spirit reminded. "You want 'em all dead? Even Junior, your precious son's going to die." Pop snapped. Spirit could not bring herself to answer as the tears began to flow like rivers down her spectacularly beautiful face. Pops kept pounding the rail of the palace overlooking the battle with his fists. Steam rose from his red face as the cool sweat ran down his cheeks. "I gotta do this, babe, I'm sorry. But our only son, you can't." Her voice trailed off as she sat back on her chair in a dead faint.